Sahapedia's Executive Director, Dr. Sudha Gopalakrishnan, to welcome our speakers. Just a moment. Sorry, just a moment. We're just trying to, just give me a moment. Yeah. Dr. Gopalakrishnan. We're just, Professor Bilimoria is just joining us. He'll join us in a couple of minutes, but he's asked us to start. He'll take a few minutes, so he asked us to just.
Okay. Or should we wait till Dr. Bilimoria comes in, or what is better?
Okay, well, we can give it 1 minute. We'll just give it 1 minute. Okay, maybe we can start now because he may take a couple of minutes and he'll.
Right. So, good evening to everybody. Welcome to this webinar on an Indian ecological philosophy by Sahapedia, organized by Sahapedia. As you all know, Sahapedia is this open online resource on the arts, cultures, and heritage of India, and also a platform for enthusiasts, experts, and students to come together for creative engagement in that sense. And today I'm delighted to welcome our distinguished panelists, Professor Purushottama Bilimoria, who will be joining us now, Dr. Meera Bendur, and also Dr. Ashim Shavastha, who have all contributed, written extensively, and also who have had many ideas to share with all of us. And we look forward to this stimulating discussion today. So please do start.
Thank you, Dr. Gopalakrishnan. This evening's webinar emerges from a project that we have been carrying out on Bhakti and Sufi traditions in different regions with the support of Bajaj Autos. And subsequent to the pandemic and its fallout, we have started to reflect on these preoccupations from a different perspective and thinking about characters and stories from spiritual literature whose action might help us make sense of natural calamity or to come to terms with personal affliction. We also are looking at rituals and how these might reflect values of care and nurturance. In May, we hosted a webinar on Sankat Mocham Hanuman, where Professor Philip Ludgendorff, spoke of how Hanuman may be seen to mediate relations between the human, natural, and divine worlds. Today, we're fortunate to have with us philosophers who have contributed much to our understanding of how what we now refer to as nature or the environment is conceived of in Indian theological and philosophical literature, represented imaginatively and invoked in our everyday practices. It is an honor to introduce Professor Purushottama Bilimoria, Dr. Meera Bendur, and Dr. Shavastha. Professor Purushottama Bilimoria is Distinguished Teaching and Research Fellow at the University of California, Berkeley, an honorary professor at the Deakin University, a senior fellow at Melbourne University, Australia, and visiting faculty at Ashoka University, Sonipat. He's been a fellow at Harvard and at Oxford. His research interests include classical Indian philosophy, continental philosophy, emotions, aesthetics, comparative ethics, and the comparative philosophy of religion. He is co-editor-in-chief of the journal Sophia and the Journal of Dharma Studies. His numerous publications include the Routledge History of Indian Philosophy, Indian Ethics, Classical Traditions and Contemporary Challenges, and the soon-to-be-published Sustainable Societies, Interreligious, Interdisciplinary Responses. Dr. Meera Bendur is subject expert for global ethics and editor of barefootphilosophers.org. She has taught at the Manipal Center for Philosophy and Humanities. She is the author of Nature in Indian Philosophical and Cultural Traditions, and her work on environmental philosophy and environmental humanities spans many domains, including how nature is conceptualized in Indian thought, gender, and religion, landscape deities and ecological practice in the Himalayas, rituals, and cultural geography. Her current work looks at Indian philosophical concepts related to the body through the framework of gender, place, ritual, and aesthetic traditions. And today she'll be drawing from her recent interpretation of ritual and how it acts to establish relations with nature. Professor Ashim Shavastha teaches 2 courses on global and Indian ecosophy at Ashoka University. He's the co-author of Churning the Earth, The Making of Global India, which offers critiques of and alternatives to India's development strategy since 1947. He's currently working on a set of 3 books, tentatively titled Srishti Sutra, which bring Rabindranath Tagore's spiritual and ecological vision into dialogue with the ecological challenges of our present. Today, he will be speaking about Tagore's writings on nature, in particular, the letters he wrote to his niece in the 80s and 90s, Chinnapatravali. Good evening, Professor Bilimoria. I'm so sorry for that slight glitch. It's wonderful to see you.
Yeah, it didn't work, sorry.
I'm very sorry that so we're really looking forward to it. So this evening, we will have, each speaker will be talking for 15 to 20 minutes. And this will be followed by a 30-minute conversation moderated by my colleague Karthike. And after that, we'll open it to the floor for discussion. Please type in your questions for the speakers in the Q&A box, and just request you to keep your mics on mute throughout the session. So thank you very much, and over to you, Karthike.
Good evening, everyone. Professor Bilimoria, would you like to start the discussion? Yeah. So I request Professor Bilimoria to start the discussion today. He will be speaking about Indian ecological ethics, which he's written about as well as his work on sustainability that he's heading at Berkeley, apart from other things. So welcome, Professor Bilimoria.
Thank you. Bonsoir. Joyous pranams in Eid al-Adha Mubarak to everyone present and tuned in. An economic professor, a colleague of mine, and public policy at UC Berkeley, Solomon Hsiang, led an econometrics team that produced a report in 2014 projecting significant economic risk from climate change in the United States and globally. The data points to these worrying concerns. The hardest hit areas will include heavily used and increasingly expensive energy sources. Labor productivity will also be hard hit as workers are sapped by the heat. Infrastructure damage from high rising sea levels will surge when combined with hurricane storm. There is roughly 50% chance that by conducting business as usual in terms of climate action, many nations' climate-related mortality rates will rise 1 to 3 times that of the motor vehicle mortality rate in the United States. The data here echoes similar findings from think tanks elsewhere in the world, and we are seeing that phenomenon increasingly with the unprecedented rise of sea levels, frequent menacing storms, hurricane, tornadoes, tsunamis, and wilderness fires in Australia and California. It is a devastating testament to the ecological crisis we're heading towards. Now let me go some 1,000 to 5,000 years back in history in the subcontinent. Now I draw here on my decade-long work on what I call philosophic historiography, that is identifying certain patterns of ideas which may complement the history of environmental thinking and how we might articulate a coherent doctrine of ecosophy. I underscore the Brahminical, Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist traditions in the ancient to classical modalities, concluding with some contemporary responses to the supposed impact or lack thereof of traditional perspectives to ecological problems facing a rapidly modernizing world, from Gandhi to Chipko. Now, Indus civilization circa 3000 BCE, namely Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, erected imposing civic edifices, mud brick and timber dwellings, complete with extensive drainage and sewer systems. The architecture and farming practices attest to the structural harmony with surrounding and climate conditions that would optimally conserve natural resources, prevent deforestation, and also appease the deities, who were little more than personified symbols of human dependence upon energies of nature. Some elements of the religious and cultural practices from the Indus period in other indigenous communities continued into the subsequent Vedic phase, which began with the Aryan pastoral nomads settling on the Gangetic plains in the 2nd millennium BCE. The agrarian culture, so much dependent on the forces of nature, is reflected in their repertory of hymns in the Vedas, among the earliest record of systematic ruminations of nature in India, invoking and appeasing the forces of nature and higher planes of light beings as devas, gods of sorts. These were used in liturgical sacrifices. Distinctive philosophical import remained largely hidden until the Mimamsakas set to work with their highly developed hermeneutical and linguistic skills, and later German Indologists used their didactic philological skills to decipher varied embedded symbolisms. The normative values the Vedic society upheld were derivative of a particular outlook on nature, of which Homo sapiens, as other species, was seen as a constitutive, at times lost, alienated, or anomalous, perhaps even offending part thereof. In other words, the values were universalized for all sentient and inanimate beings. Spirit spheres, the biosphere, that is animals and plants, and the broader biotic universe comprising the elements, stones, rocks, earth, soil, mountains, water, sky, space-time, the sun, planets, stars, galaxies, to the edges of the universe and other possible worlds. The social and moral order, in turn, is conceived as the correlate of the natural order. The vast universe was not strewn about in random chaos, but has an inner order, a unity, and an inexorable law and purpose, Rita, that governs the working of both the macrocosm and microcosm. This is brought out in the mythical dismemberment of the cosmic person, Purusha, performed by the gods as the originary sacrifice. From the cosmic sacrifice, drops of oil were collected, beasts of wings were born, and animals, wild and tame. From that, horses were born, cattle with 2 rows of teeth, cows were born from that, and from that were born goats and sheep. The moon was born from his mind, his eyes gave birth to the sun, Indra Agni came forth from the mouth, and Vayu and wind from his breath was born, and from the navel media arose. The sky arose from his head, from feet the earth, from ears the direction, thus they formed the worlds. Later verses speak of the mythological deeds of a galaxy of devas, Indra, Varuna, Mitra, Aditya, and sacred wisdom river Saraswati, and Bhudevi, Mother Earth, all personifications of nature and are to be given reverence and gratitude. And they are responsible for holding together the universe by various devices, struggles against opposing dark forces, by churning the waters of the ocean for stolen secrets, providing rain and grain from the nourishment to the deserving, and punishing with the same fetters the transgressors of the law. Thus, for example, Varuna could exercise his unstinted authority over the whole realm as its supreme binder and ruler, an arbiter and exemplar of moral conduct or righteousness by virtue of being endowed with asu, magical potent substance. The other gods who variously regulate different aspects of the biotic community are perceived as working in unison with the mind of Indra. And then he's claimed to have released the sun god Savita, who looks over to see all the other gods live according to Rita, later known as Dharma, so that there is a harmonious interplay of all elements as forces of nature. Here comes the sun, magnificent. In ecological terms, the Vedic hymns interweave a number of insights from primitive conceptions of a unique all-being, Sat or non-being, Asat, of everything, of which everything is a part, to the more complex idea of everything that being a part of unity, which is also in everything or in every part that is constitutive of the unique whole, which are reflected in modern day philosophy of panentheism. In other words, the Vedas speak of the uncanny unity of creation, and most significantly, the mysterious interconnectedness or codependence of everything to everything else. From each thing, element, and each species of bioorganism has, in this each thing, has an interest and telos, purpose to fulfill in the larger scheme of things. It is this that makes each thing sacred, but also secular, and therefore worthy of moral consideration. Either way, the universe accords our respect and deep regard for its being such, its mysterious origins, its inner workings, its regulative order, and its trajectory with which indeed existence, well-being, and future of the human and other species alike are seamlessly connected. The act of sacrifice is also sacred making and a reminder that the universe begins and is sustained by this wondrous act, and by which also it comes to an end at the close of the cyclical time. So the ancient people recognized that they could neither control the whole of nature nor interfere unduly in its order and processes to seize control of all its varied functions. And if anything, they needed the cooperation of the benign and harsh elements alike, be these the ravaging sails of the winds, the bursting of the waters, the quake of the earth, the fire of the forest, the wild beast, and so forth. So the rituals were also used to remind us of the balance and the harmony and the combination that permeates throughout the universe. Competition over the resources of nature can deplete energy levels and create an imbalance in the polar relations. The human species has no Prelapsian claim of dominionship or even stewardship over nature. A classical model of utilitarianism, which measures pain in terms of human interests alone, could not have been thought of in this context, even as a theoretical possibility. The interests of deep, whole, or species in the broadest possible sense cannot be overlooked or unreasonably compromised. And then I go on in the next part, and for shortness of time, I'll just summarize, go on to the Upanishads, which I'm sure will come up later in the discussion as well, in which the idea of Brahman comes up, which is the indivisible, undifferentiated ultimate reality, of which no greater can be conceived. Here, of course, Vedanta has been charged with life denying or the world denying, but people like Elliot Deutsch and other people have maintained that the recognition here is that fundamentally all life is one, and that in essence everything is reality. So paradoxically, when nature is seen to be valueless in most radical way, it can also be made valuable with us in creative play. Now consider the Jains, who hail from the non-Brahminic forest dwelling, and their philosophical beliefs underpins the idea that the life force exists in the four elements of earth, air, fire, water, as well as the microorganisms, plants, and animals. And everything has life, everything has sentience, and of course it's marred by karma. But once karma is removed, then the practices, then it makes room for liberation, for realization of the fullest potential of each being. To this day, they have built shelters for injured and stray animals, and they would not harm even an ant. These practices make the Jains among the earliest protagonists of animal liberation, and they excelled the Hindus and Buddhists on this moral stance. The environmental message of this remarkable faith philosophy presents interesting challenges to the development of an eco-ethical outlook. Jain precepts support and practice correct the practice of an ecologically robust lifestyle. The practice of Jain monk or nun or carefully observant layperson challenges even the deep ecologist. Indeed, Schumacher, Arnaiz, Richard Sylvan, and not least Gandhiji, among others, have taken pages from Jain eco-philosophy for their own thinking on deep ecology. In the next part, I look at Buddha. Buddha, who grew up among trees and in fact went to the forest to find his place where he could meditate for enlightenment. And of course, what he was doing was reacting to the rapid commercial urbanization and the rise of merchant and artisan classes in his region, with concomitant agrarian economy that preyed upon deforestation of the Ganges region and subsequent vanishing of animal life from their natural habitat. He made compassionate calls to show due care and loving kindness towards all sentient creatures. And where once upon a time Hindu gods would have been present, birds and animals bear witness to Buddha's testimony. And so you have in the Jataka narratives, Buddha's life among the birds, and the relationship that he set about, of course, challenged the Indic civilization and the proclivity towards sacrifice, exploitation of animals for agriculture and warfare, and subservience to the aestheticized Brahminic pan-naturalism with its ingrained fear of the forces of nature. The Buddha succeeded in shifting the perception from one of the islands or deities made out of fearful warring nature forces into benign disposition, that nature as it is. Following in his footsteps some centuries later Emperor Ashoka stage-managed an almost Fabian-style welfare system. A Gupta warrior king turned benevolent sovereign, the spiritual edge of the Dharma teaching had been eclipsed by the endgame of the hugely urbanized economy. Ashoka set about rectifying the situation by re-injecting spiritual vision into the larger structural organization of society, paying keen attention to the welfare and well-being of every living being, and the ecospheres included. He built hospices for injured animals and placed limits on overutilization of natural resources. The reason that Buddhism found greater success for its egalitarian economic template outside India than within was probably the same reason Gandhi had expressed hope in his teaching of non-violence, Swadeshi and Satyagraha, that it would find speedier realization and application outside than within the caste and priestly hierarchized society that India had become. And so till today, we have the presence and rise of engaged Buddhism in parts of Southeast Asia, from Vietnam to Thailand and in Sri Lanka also, led by Buddhist monks who actively oppose deforestation, and vast denaturing of the environment by multinational corporations and profit or bakshish-driven state interests. Lastly, moving on to sustainability. In the Sustainable Society's Interreligious Interdisciplinary Responses Volume Project from the Center for Dharma Studies in Berkeley, we argue that sustainability should place high priority on the links between environmental management, economic efficiency, and poverty reduction. We are in need of sustainability studies programs in institutes of higher education that should provide instructions in interrelated disciplines such as physical sciences, including climate science, ecology, and geography, and the social sciences such as environmental policies, ethics, economics, political science, sociology, and anthropology. As my colleague and co-editor Rita Sharma observes, the Dharma-informed interreligious sustainability studies is a new academic subdiscipline at the intersection of sustainability studies, religion, theology, and ethics. In introduction, it is urged new paradigms for ethical and existential aims that can inspire the will and enhance the imagination must emerge. Without transformed vision that compels consistent alterations in human values and behaviors, new data on the threats posed by climate change or evidence of the dangerous geophysical disruptions caused by wholesale unrestricted resource extractions will remain unheard. Planetary survival is now predicated upon the alignment of our notions of both human and ecological rights with our highest principles. In the section on global religion and worldviews, philosophical and theological insights and ecology, under which Dr. Mira Binder has a fine chapter also, to which she'll speak after me, we draw from textual sources, lived religious practices, mostly from Dharma traditions, ranging from Artha Shastra, Mahabharata, Gaudiya Vaishnavism, Ramanandis, Jains, and Buddhists, and Tagore, and so forth, in conversation with other world traditions for insights that engender altruism, empathy, and multidimensional resources that are widely available in these traditions. They reflect on major principles, discernments, and theological perspectives that organically connect human and natural worlds in various worldviews. Central tenets such as interrelatedness, radical nonviolence, reverence, and empathic compassion, and economic sustainability are explored for their application to the protection and restoration of the ecosphere. The last part, just one more 2 minutes. So it is an urgent, and also in light of the COVID-19 injected upheaval, to which reference must be made in this conversation, to pause and focus on the links between ethically cogent economic growth and religio-cultural factors. First, think of the Buddhist Shintoist management style pursued more recently by Japan and South Korea as part of the East Asian emerging economies. Both Pali and Mahayana texts stress that several interrelated, interactive, and interdependent aspects of living, singly and collectively, demand that its stakeholders strictly adhere to the ethical and moral norms laid down by the Buddha if they are to achieve the expected material well-being and moral happiness while winning as lay people both this world and the next world. So this ethical framework of the economic plan should be the respect for all living beings to live and make a living as its foundation. As such, it invites its stakeholders to adjust their lifestyle and economic goals to the norms of moderation while practicing the rules of law and discipline, Dhamma, that are grounded on such universally accepted good principles as simplicity, truthfulness, nonviolence, friendship, compassion, social justice, and equality. I guess, Karthik, I have about 1 or 2 minutes, or shall I stop here?
So you can conclude in 1 or 2 minutes. That should be fine.
Okay. So there have been few bold thinkers who have delved into moral and legal texts, as well as exemplary teachings of contemporary social reform leaders such as Vivekananda, Vidyasagar, Ramabai, Tagore, Sri Aurobindo, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, and the Dalai Lama, in order to distill ideas into what the Kolkata-based theorist, late S.K. Chakravarti, dubbed spiritual economics, shorthand for spirituality and economics. This is a messianic scheme, but rather timely, and is making the rounds, at least in Indian management and business areas. And this echoes exactly what Gandhiji has said, that economics is untrue, which disregards moral values. This extension of the law of nonviolence in the domain of economics means nothing less than the introduction of moral values. I use the adjective moral as synonymous with spiritual, end quote. What is interesting about the Gandhian model of economics is that this ideology, in this ideology, exploitation is replaced by service, acquisitiveness by renunciation or minimalism, local by global, and self-regulation by centralization. The economic system, politically non-violent, democratic, should be cooperative and constructive instead of being exclusive, competitive, and militant. And of course, Gandhiji, as everybody knows, eschewed luxurious living and so forth, and articulated a system of trusteeship. Likewise, Amartya Sen, speaks of the engendering welfare capabilities, but not GDP or GNP alone. Rather, the measure of the quality of life should encompass respect for human rights and human dignity, along with advocacy, education, health, gender equity, and ecological sensitivity. A final point. So there are some convergences here and differences, of course, between Gandhiji and Tagore's approach, which I think Biraji will enlighten us on. Final paragraph. Madhu Khanna has an interesting chapter in volume 2 of Indian Ethics titled Ethic in a Grain of Rice, demonstrating how an entire normative system and set of ecological and moral values can be extracted from insights into the life of a grain of rice. Rita or dharma from the microscopic lens rather than the macroscopic aperture for the sustenance and meaning, including ritual symbolism as offering to nature deities. The rice presents to that the rice presents to the agro communities. In a rapidly moving urban lifestyle, these traditional patterns and the significance of the Chipko movement that inspired Madhubani paintings on trees and grounds threatened by corporations and bulldozers have been lost on us. I think my time is up. Thank you very much for your patient attention.
Thank you, Professor Bilimoria, for that overview, which ranged from ancient Indian thought to modern figures like Gandhi and Tagore. I'd now like to invite Professor Bendur, and Professor Bilimoria spoke of the Upanishadic perspective where there was a conception of undifferentiated ultimate reality, and I think Professor Bendur's presentation will be in conversation with that, where she will present a dualist perspective which might help us in our engagement with nature.
Thank you, Professor Bilimoria. It was wonderful listening to you. And the work that I'm presenting today is a part of the volume that Professor Bilimoria talked about. It's on sustainability. So I have been working with a lot of Indian conceptualizations, looking at frameworks from within Indian philosophy that can actually inform us about the kind of philosophical problems in environmental humanities. So as a philosopher, my work is around concepts, and today I'm happy to present before you what I call as my Durabhinna concept. And it's very interesting that I found these two words in the Upanishads. The Upanishads, as Professor Bilimoria pointed out, are largely texts of the Brahman, which talks about the unity of the entire universe in this transcendental form. Plus, there are various different interpretations of these Upanishads, which are both dualist, non-dualist, and both dualist, non-dualist. So there are lots of streams of interpretations. But today I just picked the original text and just pull out two concepts and talk a little about them. So first of all, let me tell you that when we look at communities and nature and worship of nature as sacred, the first thing that comes to us is the explanations that scholars give about that. And the first explanation is somehow these communities perform these rituals as a part of their embedded ecology. I know that Vijaya Nagarajan talks about embedded ecology. That is, there's some kind of a nature nature relationship embedded in these rituals, which seem meaningless. She talks about the act of drawing the kolam or the rangoli on the ground as an act of thank you to the earth. It's a kind of a postcard to the earth is what I would like to call it. So there are others like Chappell who suggest that, for instance, when you know that nature is the same as you and it's your own self, your relationship, you will be more sensitive to, you'll be more intimate and connected to nature in a very deep and meaningful way. And this kind of Advaitic perspective where you and nature are one has been also talked about in various forums, including by philosophers such as, Ananias has talked a little about the ecological self. Rhea Matthews has written papers on it. So lots of scholars who have been talking about this. But my job today is not to talk about that, but to actually bring you back to the ideas of ritual. So the idea of relationship between the human and the non-human living in a state of, harmonious coexistence has a critique. And this critique is that perhaps what we ignore or fail to notice is that we are not living in that kind of, right now in this room surrounded by all this, the only nature perhaps is the kind of awareness that I will have of nature is the potted plant in front of me in my desk, or a painting of a tree and the books that I have. So in some sort, nature, the socio-cultural forces, socio-economic forces of modernity are affecting these rituals. So this whole going back to the tribal worshipping the tree and it is a sacred act is kind of forgetting that if the tribal gets a lot of money for his land, he is likely to want the modern way of living. He has aspirations which are socio-economic in nature. And though there are people who are, I know my own friends who will give up the city life, go and live in a village, not all of us do that. And so there's a kind of a pragmatic problem when it comes to actually acting on the conceptualization of nature as sacred. On the other hand, what happens with the rituals that we follow with nature, there's a Tulsi Puja that is performed every day. There is every time the lakes overflow in Bangalore, even the chief minister goes and offers something to the water body when it's overflowing. It's one of those things. So there is Shardul Puja, for instance, which is performed in, it's a sacred Adivasi ritual, which was performed in some place. Then what happened was ethical derivations from these become a form of tokenism. It's like just because I worship the tree doesn't become sacred, doesn't translate into the ethical. So sacred remains sacred. And then Afal Parul Manjuli and others talk about how we've seen that in the case of the Ganga. Just worshipping the Ganga as sacred doesn't make it, doesn't stop people from actually polluting the river itself, right? And I can tell you of an incident from my own experience of the Ganga, that when we were talking to the people about polluting the Ganga and not letting their sewage flow directly into the Ganges, somewhere in the markets of Uttarkashi, which sadly was washed away in the recent flood storm. But those people were telling me that it's okay, it's just mother, right? When a mother lifts up a child and the child does child dirties her sari, she's not going to mind because she is mother. So that kind of, it shocked me because the relationship was that of mother, and mother is supposed to be forgiving. So actually kinship relationship with nature, where you think mother is mother nature, also tend to, if you're good, already in a society where kinship relationships are already in a hierarchy, they're already patriarchal, then if you make nature into a woman, it's likely that even nature will suffer the same fate as women in a normal family. So she'll be made to work for you. She has to sacrifice everything for you. It doesn't matter if she gets hurt a little. So in a society that is already culturally ridden with social inequities and social inequalities, it is very difficult to continuously say relate to nature. And then that relationship to nature would be a problem as an ethical problem, like it wouldn't translate into ethical care for nature. So, let me move on to the next thing. So what does, let's look at the nature worship, even if we ignore the background of it for now. Most nature worship that happens in agrarian and rural communities, and also some urban communities, because large part of, I've heard people saying that cities are just large villages. Yeah, they're conglomerations of villages. We can pretend to be that we are this urban metropolitan person, but actually we have this, we have this village kind of attitudes in little pockets, and very few of us have got out of the what we call the kind of rurality in our own ethical and urban thinking. So let's look at this. Some of them are responses to natural and geographical triggers. For example, you will have like the first flowering, in Kerala, when that particular tree flowers, that it's going to be there's going to be a puja done. These are not the mainstream Brahminical rituals of, today is a ritual day. Actually, today is Varamahalakshmi Puja, where the wife prays for the longevity of the husband. And there's a Lakshmi Puja also done today in India. But that's not the point. So these are all mainstream rituals which are highly mediated by texts and Brahminical discourses. But there are other rituals which are like, it's not exactly a kind of a ritual, but it's also a very home ritual. It's more about the ecology of the household. For example, every time the first rain comes, my grandmother would have all the, would change the house furniture around. She will start asking us to shut the windows, and she'll say, this rain is not healthy for you. And a kind of a seasonal response is there followed in the house. Many of our households also, after the first rains in April finish, my grandmom would bring out all the pickle vessels, and we'll start this ritual of preparing the pickles. And the first pickle is usually offered to God, or there's particular mantras to be said over it, or there's a song to be sung. So these kind of very inbuilt rituals, these are not rituals which are mediated by mantras and fires and offerings, but they're kind of rituals that we follow based on the seasons, which the trigger is the environment itself. So the first snow in the Himalayas signifies that the Devtas are going to go to some other place and take a bath. So the local deities go for this procession and they go and take a bath. And then everything revolves around triggers from the environment. In many areas, they have disappeared, but it's important to look for ecological themes in this kind of socio-cultural rituals. It's also important to understand, ask, why do we do these rituals? A lot of people tell us that these rituals are absolutely useless and worthless, and they're meaningless, and we should just get rid of them. We should be scientific and stuff like that. But what I want to say is that the conceptualization of nature in these is not only based on a kinship relationship, but is based on a way of foregrounding nature. Okay, so first I'll just talk about this two words that I picked out of the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. When Yama is talking to Nachiketa, he says, knowledge and ignorance, vidya and avidya. Knowledge and non-knowledge are both dura, bhinna. Dura, distant from each other, and they're also anya, they're different. He uses three words. He actually says anya, dura, and he says viparita, vibhinna, anya. The commentator also adds these words. So you have an aspect of difference and distance. Now, when I was studying environmental philosophy, at that time, Stephen Mokel's paper, which is very famous, talks about nature as origin and nature as difference. So Western philosophy has this very robust theory about how nature could be. We are a part of nature because we have originated from nature. We are a part of the total embeddedness of nature. We are biologically one with nature. And then there's the other one which says human and non-human are very different, and we have no connection at all because anything to do with human, so nature for us is non-human. And both these binaries did not fit the Indian cultural conceptualization of nature. Because when I was talking to people in my interviews, they would say, when I talk to common people, they would say everything is Prakriti. Because for us, Prakriti, even the table and everything comes from this divine nature, or anything material, anything immaterial, everything comes in Prakriti. So I was struggling with this, and then suddenly I realized that what we are thinking of is Durabhinna. So our kinship relationship with nature, perhaps we could take these concepts and apply it to our relationship with nature. It's very simple, the kinship relationship of a distant relative, which is very, very peculiar to Indian philosophy. So you have this Indian cultural traditions, right? Distant relatives are related, they are distant, but we are different from them. They are not like our near and dear relatives. Distant relatives are distant by ritual. So during weddings and things, the distant relative will become our closer relative. We become aware of them, we become aware of their families. And then when they move away, they're different from us. They are someone else. So they're both stranger and intimate to us. So in that sense, I feel that just the word difference and distance is not, when you say distance, you are saying that a seed is distant from a tree because one day potentially it can become a tree. And then when you're saying that seed is different from a tree, you're saying in terms of its property and what it can do, it is different. This particular idea of both Dura and Vinna is very important for our ethics, the way we articulate ethics towards the environment. And I'll just come back to this because when we are one with something, we have something which people call as the Indistinguishability Thesis. Val Plumwood says, drawing from other philosophers, that when we are too close to somebody, we cannot care for them because we can't have an ethical relationship because it's like we are taking things for granted. That's an easy way to say it. Like we take things for granted because we are so close to that person, we cannot distinguish their needs from our needs and our needs from their needs. So nature, if you're too close to nature, perhaps we do not realize that nature needs our care. You know, it's always been there and it's kind of invisible. When you're too close to somebody, it becomes invisible. So when you have this duality, when you break it up as difference, as not exclusive difference, but as difference of potentiality, there is a distance created which allows for care. And this is kind of the central theme of the care ethics in feminism, that duality is good for care. It is good to keep your loved object away from you, and then you are able to love it. If it is inside you, you cannot. Reminded me of what Krishna Paramahamsa asked his disciples, do you want to be sugar or do you want to eat sugar? And the dualist disciples said, we want to eat sugar. And the Advaita disciples said, I want to be sugar. And they laughed at him and said, oh, you want to be sugar? It's so boring. It's better to eat the sugar, you can enjoy it. So the idea of aesthetic rasa, aesthetic involvement in ethics also comes in at this point of time. So finally, I want to move on to this last 2 or 4 minutes of talking about what then is the purpose of rituals. If you ask for the meaning of rituals, it's very difficult because you go and ask somebody, why do you keep a bindi on the forehead? You'd come up with this esoteric explanation of, oh, it's a third eye chakra and then it blocks people's bad emotions. All that fine, but there's that is a kind of a response which is deeply problematic for the modern world. A lot of women who do not believe in a third eye chakra will stop using bindis. So, but it is a ritual. We just go every day and then put a bindi, put a earring, dress ourselves. It's a kind of a ritual thing. So instead of asking what is the meaning of the ritual, I think philosophers have suggested that it's better to ask the question, what purpose does this ritual serve? And when I started looking at rituals in environment, I started asking that question and it was more useful to find. So rituals are modes of closing distance and creating a difference. And for me, what is there is what these rituals do is open up the possibility of encountering the textuality of nature. What do I mean by textuality? A text is not a simple narrative. It's also a textuality, a physical presence. So when, supposing you think of ritual as a text, a kind of a ordered thing that you do, the background of it is the actual physicality of the experience. So when you go and actually dip yourself into the Ganges ritually, then you're actually foregrounding the Ganges or the river or the lake that has been invisible as a background in your life, which is not noticed. The tulsi plant, the little insect, the bird, you know, you put grains to ants every day as a ritual, those ants become real and they're foregrounded. They were always there. It's not that you're creating them, but in feeding the ants every day in a form of a habit or a ritual, you're actually creating this foregrounding of the textuality, foregrounding the experience. You're more likely to, if you have an encounter with a wounded bird on the road, you're more likely to show care and compassion than if you sit back and say, oh, I have to be a vegan, I have to be a vegetarian. So there's this whole encounter with nature, which has turned a lot of people's lives and made them more ethically aware of nature. And this encounter is mediated by these rituals. And I think our ancient people created these rituals. And I can give you one example from the Puranas and the Bhakti tradition, which is very important. You must remember that Lord Krishna himself, when he told people not to do a fire sacrifice and instead worship Mount Govardhan as a ritual, actually did that. He created a ritual for nature that would foreground their resource, that would foreground nature that supports them, rather than work with a text or a Veda that would just praise some Indra who's invisible. Right? So the foregrounding of the Govardhan mountain is a kind of an exemplar of how nature is foregrounded in rituals that are around nature. Of course, there are a lot of rituals which are also detrimental to nature. We have the stick hunting and other kinds of different rituals which have been set in different times, and they're kind of stagnant in a very ancient world where nature was plentiful and there was danger from wild animals. I think those are the ones that the conservationists have to fight. But a lot of times what happens is we go into communities, give them ecological knowledge, conservation knowledge, and then we give them scientific knowledge and take away that which is rich and replete with multiple meanings and that which is embedded and culturally relevant for that community. And that, I think, is a danger, that scientific knowledge cannot replace the textuality of cultural rituals. So rituals create a space for this encounter. Once this encounter has foregrounded nature, the object is rendered visible, then it's subjected to the hermeneutical act. So hermeneutical act, or the act of interpretation of ritual, is actually later. It is preceded, or before the hermeneutical act, you have the encounter, you have the textuality. Just end with this last thing, the devta. So what happens is the first snow falls, and then these people say, oh, we have to take the devta to the tal, to the lake. And then immediately it's like, ab ghas lane ki time ho gaya, bichan lane ki time ho gaya. So it's like, I have to get ready for winter, I have to collect my firewood, I have to do this. So people begin to then compare last year's frost or crop with this year's yield. So without immediate experience where a human being is physically present in nature or uses his or her sense, there cannot occur any immediate interpretation. And that interpretation may not also become ethical. They may just exist a set of mass secondary interpretations, because if you're sitting somewhere else and not encountering this nature every day, our ethics to the best is just mere dry text. So I'm just ending with this, that Plumwood says that this is where we should stop looking at generalities, and we've ignored the particular, as Purushottama Bilimoria ji also pointed out. We've started ignoring the microcosm, we've started ignoring the particulars. And I think it's important for us now to go particular in our ethics, rather than look at this general all-purpose, we have to save nature kind of. We have to go into the particulars of our relationship with nature. And that when we take a collective, each person having this relationship with nature, the collective also has a relationship to nature. And maybe then we can move on to bringing people to environmental ethics. The point is not environmental ethics, but how do you get people to be ethical towards the environment? So that's a bigger challenge. And Karthik, I'm okay with time? Yeah. Yeah, with that.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Bengal. There's so many interesting observations there, especially regarding the significance of the ritual and the importance of distance for care, which was one of your primary points. What interested me was when you said that the sacred doesn't necessarily translate into the ethical. And I think that would make for a good segue into Rabindranath, because for it, as far as I've been able to understand his thought, there is no ethical without the sacred for Rabindranath. So, Professor Ashim, the floor is open to you.
Thank you, Karthikeya, and thank you, Meeraji, for a wonderful presentation. Lots to think about there. I would like to also thank Niharika and Sahapedia for giving me this opportunity to speak to you. I've given my talk a title. It's called "The Poet as a Midwife of Truth, Rabindranath's Experience of Nature." And for today's talk, I keep in mind a very simple question. If he were alive today, how would Rabindranath interpret the planetary ecological crisis we now face? And I imagine it is this overwhelming question which motivates the conversation this evening. Our interest in Indian ecological thought is, I assume, primarily on this account. The crisis would not surprise Rabindranath in the slightest, even if its rapidly growing scale and accelerating velocity would give him cause for shock. As someone who took a long, enduring, critical look at the modern age, especially after the epic devastation of the Great War of 1914, Tagore is among the very few who saw this catastrophe coming a century ago. Let me cite a few instances of this. In a long neglected essay called Robbery of the Soil, sometimes also rendered as City and Village, written just after the war, Tagore observes the colonialism implicit in modernity. He says, quote, "Civilization has turned into a vast catering establishment. It maintains constant feasts for a whole population of gluttons. The intemperance which could have been tolerated in a few has spread to the multitude. A civilization with an unnatural appetite must feed on numberless victims, and these are being sought in the parts of the world where human flesh is cheap. The happiness of entire peoples in Asia and Africa is being sacrificed to provide fastidious fashion with an endless train of respectable rubbish." He continues, "Mother Earth has enough for the healthy appetite of her children, and sometimes a little extra for rare cases of abnormality, but she has not nearly sufficient for the growth of a whole world of spoiled and pampered children," unquote. Now, Tagore is fully aware that greed and its collaborative passions are not inventions of the modern era. And yet, something has changed at a profound level when it comes to the place of greed in the scale of human values. And this is what he has to say on it, quote, "I do not for a moment mean to imply that in any particular period of history, men were free from the disturbance of their lower passions. Selfishness ever had its share in government and trade. Yet there was a struggle to maintain a balance of forces in society. For in those days, our intellect was not tempted to put its weight into the balance on the side of overgreed." So what has changed in modern times? And this is his explanation. It's a bit lengthy, so please bear with me. Quote, "In recent centuries, a devastating change has come over our mentality with regard to the acquisition of money. Such state of things has come to pass because with the help of science, the possibilities of profit have suddenly become immoderate. The whole of the human world, through its length and breadth, has felt the gravitational pull of a giant planet of greed with concentric rings of innumerable satellites, causing in our society a marked deviation from the moral orbit. In the last fatal stages of disease, this fatal influence of money has got into our brain and affected our heart. It has not only science for its ally, but other forces that have some semblance of religion, such as nation worship and the idealizing of organized selfishness. Its methods are far-reaching and sure, like the claws of a tiger's paw, they are softly sheathed. Its massacres are invisible because they are fundamental, attacking the very roots of life. Its plunder is ruthless behind a scientific system of screens, almost anticipating our time. which have the formal appearance of being open and responsible to inquiries, an unscrupulous system of propaganda paves the way for widespread misrepresentation. It works out the crowd psychology through regulated hypnotic doses at repeated intervals, administered in bottles with moral labels upon them of soothing colors. In fact, man has been able to make his pursuit of power easier today by his art of mitigating the obstructive forces that come from the higher region of his humanity. With his cult of power and his idolatry of money, he has, in a great measure, reverted to his primitive barbarism, a barbarism whose path is lit up by the lurid light of intellect. But it lacks the ideal to impart to it the depth of moral responsibility. So this is his long take on what exactly has gone wrong in the modern era, not that it's in some moral sense more decrepit than previous eras of history, but something has changed because of the role of science and the way in which it engages the human intellect and imagination. So this is what Tagore writes in an essay called The Modern Age, soon after the Great War. And all this is by way of simply establishing how well he was anticipating the crisis we now face 100 years later, anticipating it in a lot of great precise detail. Now, I want to move to discussing how Rabindranath would actually like to see things in the sense of what should be our relationship to nature and how have we misunderstood our place in the scheme of things, what Professor Bilimoria was saying, the Ritta, the order of the cosmos. In what sense have we failed to understand it? So how should our relationship with the rest of the natural world actually be? So in the remainder of this talk, I shall try to draw out some of the many ways in which Tagore's attitude to nature is marked by fundamental differences with the default vision of the European Enlightenment, which continues to define cognitive modernity and the modern experience to this day. This is something which many philosophers have commented on. Mary Midgley in Science and Poetry does a particularly good job of making this clear. So I shall make my observations by quoting examples from Tagore's writings. First, at the most obvious historical level, the European Enlightenment shaped Western modernity in terms of a secular cosmology in which the idea of progress was prominent. This progress is supposed to transpire at least three levels. At the epistemic level, greater, more accurate and precise knowledge of nature and the universe through advancements in science and technology is central to the Enlightenment project. At the moral plane, humanity is expected to come ever closer to the cherished ideals of liberty, fraternity, and equality. Better knowledge of nature and the universe is meant to bring us nearer to what Immanuel Kant called perpetual peace. Materially, as a consequence of the synergy of moral and epistemic advancement, economic progress is to be expected. In fact, today's global mantra of economic growth is rationalized very often in precisely these terms. If you look at the recent work of Steven Pinker, or even the popular work of somebody like Yuval Noah Harari. Now, Tagore dissents quite sharply from all this. He believes that civilization and progress are actually two quite different things. Now, remember that as an Indian believer, his notion of civilization draws from what Professor Bilimoria was speaking about earlier as dharma, right? So dharma is quite different from progress for Tagore. In the modern age, especially after the Great War, Rabindranath believes that they have parted company. In a talk he gives in China in 1924, he's eloquent in his denunciation of progress. Quote, "We have for over a century been dragged by the prosperous West, behind its chariot, choked by the dust, deafened by the noise, humbled by our own helplessness, and overwhelmed by the speed. We agreed to acknowledge that this chariot drive was progress and that progress was civilization. If we ever ventured to ask progress towards what and progress for whom, it was considered to be peculiarly and ridiculously oriental to entertain such doubts about the absoluteness of progress. Of late, a voice has come to us bidding us to take count not only of the scientific perfection of the chariot, but of the depth of the ditches lying across its path, unquote. So Tagore contrasts this with the idea of civilization, and he gives a very nice example from Afghanistan when the British were bombing Afghanistan. This is sometime during I think towards the end of World War I, if I'm not mistaken. And he says the following: "It is the mission of civilization to set for us the high standard of valuation. The Mahsud," this is the tribe in Afghanistan, "the Mahsud may have many faults for which he should be held accountable, but that which has imparted for him more value to hospitality than to revenge may not be called progress, but is certainly civilization." What had happened was that a bomber had crashed, and instead of taking revenge upon the pilots, the village community actually brought them relief and succor. This is roughly Tagore's take on the distinction between progress and civilization, and how the modern age has mixed these two things up, and much to our detriment. The second point, which is worth making when one is looking at Tagore in contrast to the Enlightenment, is that the practical achievements of science and technology have actually pretty much set the standard for what knowledge is and should be, certainly in the popular imagination. The poetic romantics, after all, were left aside in the first half of the 19th century itself, people like Wordsworth and Blake and so on. And poetry came to be seen more and more as an expression of human feeling rather than giving us a mode of knowledge or wisdom. And Rabindranath couldn't disagree with this more. I mean, for him, poetry is a deeper mode of apprehension. And unlike science, which gains knowledge about nature through gradual accretion, he says that poetry's apprehension of truth in our soul is immediate and through direct intuition. So he ranks poetry somewhere. It reminded me of what the American writer Ursula Le Guin said some time back. I'm quoting her here: "Science describes nature accurately from outside. Poetry describes nature accurately from inside. Science explicates, poetry implicates." And Rabindranath's poetry clearly does. The third point worth making about Tagore's view of the legacy of the Enlightenment is that for Enlightenment philosophers and thinkers, nature was not a mode of self-realization. And here is the Indian ecological thinker in Rabindranath coming to the fore and saying, how can you do without nature? If you want any sort of self-realization, nature is a must. Its surrounding presence is the greatest enabler of realization. He says you can discover all the laws of nature through science, but he says it's like a railway station, but the station platform is not home. So this is, reminiscent of Heidegger's concern about modern homelessness and where it arises from in his essay, The Question Concerning Technology as well as in Being and Time. For Tagore, the power of possession has driven out what he calls the power of union. And he says that for us, the highest truth of this world is not knowing it and making use of it, but realizing our own selves in it through the expansion of sympathy, not alienating ourselves from the natural world, but relating ourselves to it in such a way that we unite with it. The sign of such union is for Tagore the experience of beauty. This is the aesthete in him now. And to such an aesthete, beauty is truth itself. It is not a luxury, it's a necessity. It's as important for his soul as food is for his stomach. He relates it to something that he describes at length as the angel of surplus. This is the infinite in humanity, the infinite as expressed in humanity, needing to expend itself in and through human living, through human expression and creativity. And that angel of surplus finds inspiration through its union with nature. The fourth point where Rabindranath descends sharply from the dominating anthropocentrism of the Enlightenment is that if you look at somebody like Descartes, Now, Descartes' driving motivation for all the vast amount of thinking that he did was, I quote here, to arrive at knowledge highly useful in life and thus render ourselves the lords and possessors of nature. And this is a result to be desired, he says. So this is in the Discourse on Method. And not only Descartes, but in the next century, Immanuel Kant himself, perhaps the preeminent voice of the Enlightenment, says, quote, as the sole being on earth who has reason and thus a capacity to set voluntary ends for himself, man is certainly the titular lord of nature. And if nature is regarded as a teleological system, then it is his vocation to be the ultimate end of nature, right? Unquote. So in other words, reason and not consciousness or sentience is seen by Kant as the privileging mark of the human. Not surprisingly, such a belief has been the basis of much anthropocentric thinking and practice since the early days of the Industrial Revolution. For Tagore, by contrast, for man, reality is measured by the scope of his consciousness. These are his words, the scope of his consciousness, not of his reason. And importantly, such cognitive awareness is pre-analytic, even pre-discursive, and there are things in consciousness immeasurably deeper than reason as far as Tagore is concerned. Fifth, modernity measures progress in terms of the distance that humanity traveled away from the jungle. This is partly what it means to have become the lords of nature. For Rabindranath, the term progress is of limited significance. He claims that India has traditionally been an Aranya Sanskriti, a culture of the forest. For such a culture, human life is principally about self-realization, for which the continual presence of nature, especially the forest and the mountain and the stream and so on, are necessary. This is how our seers sought mukti, and they would retreat to the tapovan, the forest hermitage. And true freedom, Tagore argues, is unattainable without such a living presence of the natural world. So what the West calls freedom is something other than that. And number 6, he says, not surprisingly, a vision like that of the Enlightenment justifies the remaking of the world in the image of reason, in the image of human reason. The cumulative abstractions of science take command of consciousness and mediate our cognition of phenomena, profoundly shaping our experience of nature, including that of our own bodies. With the enthroning of abstractions comes growing layers of alienation between nature and the human mind. Facts discovered by scientists take precedence over one's own subjective experience of nature. Nature ceases to remain an integral part of human reality. It is seen as something out there, distant from us. One fails to discover anything for oneself. Wonder comes to an end with a tired feeling that someone somewhere has all the answers to the riddles of existence. Time is short, so I'm going to skip some of what I was going to share from Sadhana and other texts where Rabindranath is harsh on the modern habit of letting abstractions stand in place of the real thing. Children learn about horses in books rather than seeing one and touching one and smelling one and so on. His conclusion in Sadhana is that the ultimate truth about earth and water lies in our apprehension of the eternal will which works in time and takes shape in the forces we realize under those aspects. This is not mere knowledge as science is, but it is a perception of the soul by the soul. So you need to have your own soul awake in order to recognize soul anywhere else beyond yourself. This does not lead us to power as knowledge does, but it gives us joy, which is the product of the union of kindred things. The man whose acquaintance with the world does not lead him deeper than science leads him will never understand what it is that the man with the spiritual vision finds in these natural phenomena. In other words, whatever liberties the pursuit of knowledge, wealth, and power may have secured the modern world since the days of the Enlightenment, true freedom still eludes us because of its indifferent or antagonistic relationship to the natural world. Exactly how our relationship to nature is to be healed and restored to mutual health is the substance of what Raimondo Panikkar calls ecosophy, the wisdom of the earth, quite a different thing from our wisdom about the earth, which is what Panikkar understands from science. It calls upon us to listen and pay attention to the natural world where we've been too busy with our own limited projects. The contemplative intelligence we need for such a task is what we can learn from the vast legacy of Rabindranath. Thank you for listening patiently.
Thank you so much, Professor. So many things again to think about there. We have around 45 minutes left, and I don't want to take away too much from the time for the audience to ask questions. So if you have any questions, please do go ahead and post them in the Q&A section, and we'll take them up one by one. Just by way of a comment, and perhaps all of you can refer to this as we go into the audience questions. Professor Ashim mentioned that Tagore's quote about how in Western civilization perhaps progress is measured by the distance that we've come from nature, right? And that that in a sense ties to what I wanted to ask, which is about the relevance of an ecological ethics that we're trying to draw here from the past for the current situation and our current, how we are placed right now. And Professor Bendur, she mentioned that, the only kind of access to nature in a sense is to the potted plant, and even when we are having this conversation, it's mediated through a screen. So there seems to be an essential difference here, where on the one hand you're measuring progress with the distance from nature, and on the other hand, both in Professor Bendur's talk, when she talked about the continuous need for encounter and foregrounding of nature, through the act of the ritual, or when Professor Bilimoria spoke about dharma and the idea of natural and even cosmic cycles being embedded there. So I just wanted to throw open this question about how do we try to translate these ethical ideas which seem so remote in the sense that they seem to be placed in a reality that is so structurally different from the reality of the technological and the market-driven, reality that we inhabit today. And perhaps if there are any responses to this, then we can start by this, and then we can go into the questions of the audience. Professor Bilimoria, Professor Bendur, if you'd like to.
Sure. I mean, since I began with the rituals of the Vedic tradition and so on, I mean, I think they didn't have the sort of challenges that we have today of, technology and vast developments of industrialization and so on. So, A, they had time on their hand, but B, that was their technology. I mean, you use the Heideggerian sort of term of techne. That's how, that was so very much part of it. They didn't see that as a distinct thing. They weren't kind of adding on something. It wasn't a whole secular world, sort of the division of religion and what do we call it, state and law and so forth. It was very integrated in that way. So it was sort of part and parcel of the whole thing. And you have that in the Chinese Confucian tradition as well, where the idea of Li, sort of the ritual is itself a moral imperative. It's itself sort of moral, a rather moral enactment. It's performance of morality. Otherwise, morality just remains as a sort of abstract sets of calculations and ideas and so on. And Li was. So, there's a filial piety as a ritual of how one behaves, towards the elders and how one behaves towards nature and so forth. And, we have that to some extent, still pretty much alive in India. And Miraji mentioned quite a number of the sort of rituals. I mean, there is in Kerala, for example, women wake up and they pour water on plants and trees and worship each one, and then they go on with their business. It's not seen. So I think we have to sort of see it differently. In a way, it's well, it's been brought back to some extent in Singapore, with a sort of revival of Confucianism, but it didn't quite sort of take the flavor of traditional Confucian rites and rituals. It was still very much sort of secular or secularized in that sense. And it's not difficult. I mean, we do, even in our secular society, have rituals. I mean, we have waking rituals, we have, drinking rituals, and we have partying, and, all kinds. So we have vacations. I mean, all these are rituals in their own way. And I think if we bring in the kinds of propositions that are being talked about in this, in the presentations, both Professor Shavastha and Dr. Binders as well, then these things can be brought in. In other words, there's sort of a spiritualization of the world, and it doesn't have to be aligned to sort of theism or any kind of belief in higher transcendental reality and so on. I mean, Buddhism never had that, and yet it's full of rituals in that sense, and Jainism also. It's every vow is a kind of an enactment of a vow is a ritual as well. So it's not as difficult. I mean, I think we've made ourselves very what Marcuse calls sort of one-dimensional persons. I mean, we've become automatons, and so we've kind of lost that connection, lost that touch. But people who have lived, indigenous people, Aboriginal people who have lived in close harmony with nature, have nature speak to them, and there is a kind of symbiotic relation which brings out those enactments in ritual form.
I would like to add that there are two aspects of imagining nature. I don't want to use the word reimagining. One of the things that in India we should know that we haven't moved from, we are still in the world of ecotopia. Now, ecotopia means you're looking at a utopia where the ecological is as an achievable goal than just the utopian view of a perfect world. So ecotopia has been talked about, for example, in Bana's Kavya, where he talks about the ashrams, the spiritualization, as you call it. So there's this whole, what people are doing when they give up their lucrative IT jobs and go and start organic farming is a kind of an act of trying to achieve that ecotopia. And what is the opposite of ecotopia is eco-fear. Now that's when my American student screeches and runs out of the room when there's a lizard, right? We haven't gone into that, though I have seen certain urban kids running away from lizards and spiders, but a lot of my Indian friends are okay with spiders living in their corner as long as they don't come out. We don't have that fear of insects. The other thing that we do is we prioritize trees. We prioritize charismatic species. And this, I know my ecological scientists and my conservationist friend also have talked about it. We think of nature as trees and as green, but there's a lot of nature in the desert sands. There's nature in insects. There's nature in ants, in all kinds of creatures, in frogs. That's why probably we have frog weddings. We don't have tiger weddings. We have frog weddings. So in some sense, some of our practices from the agrarian communities, we probably also, indigenous communities, talk about these little butterflies, these little insects, which are also very much nature. So kind of broadening our own understanding of ecology and nature on one hand, plus scientific education, conservation, all that can go on. But on the popular level, to foster an imagination of ecotopia rather than eco-fear. I think that's a good way to proceed. And maybe people can sit down and think of what an ecotopia is. More books need to be written on ecotopia. All the strange novels that I read, nature is very horrible. It comes and swallows and beasts come and attack you. There's a kind of medieval fear of nature which is brought out in all these, even the young adult novel. Nature is very unforgiving. But there's also the nature in India which is like sustaining, which is life affirming, which nature helps the human being in so many ways. But the tales are like that. So we need to recast the narratives. We need to retell some stories.
Thank you. Niharika, would you like to come in to introduce the audience questions?
Yeah. Thank you, Karthikeya. So there's one question. Could you please say something on the Indian idea of energy? And sorry, the modern hunt for fuel or extractive energy happens to be key to the idea of ecological imbalance. And how does the Indian idea of energy and Indian idea of energy offer an alternative? Should I, maybe I should take one or two questions together. I'll take about 3 questions and then I'll sort of try to remind you of them if that's possible. And then there's a question for Professor Ashim. How does the development of Shantiniketan as a premier institution today factor into Tagore's concept of the Tapovan? And this, the question of the speaker flags the estrangement of Santhal communities from the Shantiniketan space. Okay, sorry, should we start with these? Maybe I think we can just begin with that then. The Indian idea of energy would,
well, you know, I mean, I did mention energy a fair bit. The idea that you know, the whole cosmos is infused with energy. I mean, I think that kind of distinction, the Newtonian distinction that we had of, you know, hard matter on the one hand and energy on the other hand, doesn't quite work. So if you take something like the Sankhya tradition, you know, you have the Purusha and Prakriti, but neither is functional without a combination of the two, and what comes out is really, in a way, energy. And, you know, in the classical tradition too, there's Tejas, there's Shakti, and the one that I mentioned, potent substance, and the energies that we also create through our rituals, through the sacrifice and so forth. You know, Mimamsakas call that apurva. And so everything is run and geared by energy. The sun gives energy. So I don't know that, you know, the Indian conception of energy is sort of really, in a way, any different from a number of Western conceptions. I mean, there's a whole lot of, if you look at the medieval traditions, right up till Galen and so on, you know, their ideas of energy were sort of very biologically laced as well. I know our terms of animus, anima, animate, inanimate come from more that than anything else. But, you know, there are some semblances now to sort of, you know, post special relativity or Einsteinian, and especially in quantum, the breakdown of matter into energy or just energy, you know, before even matter is formed, or out of which matter is formed, is quite, you know, it's quite a prominent notion. Or you take process philosophy, the idea is that, you know, the whole thing, everything is energy, natura naturans, from which nature evolves, as it were, you know, nature emanates. And so the conservation of that energy is really the main imperative. It's really the main challenge that we have, so that the equilibrium is not broken, and we have access to that energy from our engagement in the material world, in the terrestrial world, and so on. And that's the form of energy that we have facing us right ahead. But, you know, we depend on that to extract energy. But of course, what's happened is with the fossil fuel industries, is that we're extracting way too much energy, and dangerous ones as well. So, you know, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, methane emissions, and so on, and they then destroy or devastate, erode other forms of energies that are there. So our ozone level, you know, which controls energies from sun rays, X-rays, and so forth, broken down. And so, you know, we're losing energy as a result of that, and that's causing an El Nino effects, and so there's the rise of the sea levels and so forth. So I think that would be that would. And there are a number of people who sort of worked on, you know, aligning for example, in Tao of Physics, Fritz of Capra, and these people, Weber, Ken Wilber, they actually see that way down, the base of the fundamentals that our universe is made of. That energy is not unlike what is talked about in tantric traditions, or in Sankhya, or in yoga for that matter as well. So the dance of Shiva is the same. It's the same thing that's fundamentally going on there. It's what we do with it is what's different.
Thank you very much, Professor Bilimoria. I should have added that the questioners thanked all the speakers for their wonderful presentations. So Professor Shavastha, would you like to take the question on Shantiniketan and Tagore's concept of the Tapovan, and also the question of the estrangement of Santhal communities from the space?
Yeah, well, Tagore starts Shantiniketan in 1901, soon after his wife died. And for the second half of his life of 80 years, his last 40 years he lived in Shantiniketan. And Shantiniketan is very much a modern experiment which tries to revive the idea of the Tapovan in a very dry, red laterite soil of Birbhum in Bengal. The Santals inhabit contiguous villages to Shantiniketan, and my impression is exactly the same, that they were alienated from Shantiniketan for the most part for the longest time. But here is what I feel happened sometime in the 1920s, I think, is that more and more of Tagore's poetry, music, and especially his art, and especially when you look at his paintings, which he starts doing in his mid-60s, start reflecting sensibilities which are actually not easily recognizable in modern trends of painting. They are almost primitivist in their expression. And my own hypothesis is, and I've discussed it with a few people, including somebody who teaches art in Shantiniketan, that he was actually influenced substantially, subliminally first and more consciously later, by Santhal. So personally, subjectively, I think a lot of his creative expressions after his mid-60s or so start showing that. Just like in the case of his stay in East Bengal when he was looking after his family estates in the 1890s, he came more and more under the influence of Baul music, and the Bauls played a huge part in Tagore's poetic and musical imagination thereon. Tagore was a great assimilator at a personal level, and he was able to absorb from multiple traditions, whether it was the Romantics of Europe or the influence of Bauls or Santals in India. As far as the institution itself is concerned, other than absorbing some of the Santal architecture in the way the huts are made and so on, I don't see much of that influence in Shantiniketan, certainly right now. It's very much a mainstream kind of setup. If you go there now, that's what you will see.
Thank you. There are a number of questions about rituals. One is, how do we address the casteism that comes with ritual? After all, many rituals are not performed by Shudras or Dalits. And aren't we in danger of, when we adopt these rituals, of adopting the casteist approach towards sustainability? There's another question, I will club. We have been trying to change the way the Ganesh festival is celebrated to make it more sensitive to ecology using natural and biodegradable materials. And it is possible Hindu philosophy has space for reinterpretation of ritual to context and time. But since most ritual today is practiced without knowledge of the origin, there is a fear of change. And is it better to try and change traditional rituals or reinvent new rituals that are sensitive to both spiritual belief as well as to ecology? So, should we?
So I guess that will be addressed to me. So one of the things that I want to point out is, yes, the point is when we think of rituals, we're already, by saying rituals belong to the Brahminical traditions, we're already excluding indigenous communities. But actually rituals do not belong to only Brahminical communities. The kind of rituals you're talking about are the basic spiritual Vedic rituals of fire sacrifices and all. Indigenous communities have much more ritualized behavior because anthropologists go and study these rituals, right? They go and study the so-called indigenous communities and their rituals. So it is not necessary that rituals, when we are talking about rituals, we're not talking about the puja in your puja room. We're talking about rituals of nature. In fact, a lot of times, the mainstream tries to assimilate the landscape deities and the local goddesses into the mainstream deities. For example, take for example, the celebration of Battama. I think she's called Battama in Hyderabad. This is a women's festival. They gather all these leaves and diverse flowers, decorate the pots and gather in the lakes, and they have a ceremony for that. They gather a lot of different kinds of I also remember Professor Bilimoria putting a photograph of a goddess. The goddesses simply get absorbed into Durga. It's a kind of a hegemonic absorption. So one of the things you can do is to actually write, read, and like Sahapedia is an interesting initiative itself. It's like trying to bring out these origins and the things. The second thing is we cannot find the origin of the we are also becoming secular and modern. And as we become secular and modern, there is a problem with certain kinds of rituals. I've almost given up doing my Ganesha festival in the way that people do it, because I don't think the original Vedic Ganesha was a deity of the kind of Sankat Mochan Ganesh. I think he was the monsoon cloud, right? So the original deity, we didn't bother to do this grandiose celebration of Ganesha. My great-grandmother used to just make a little mountain of turmeric and worship that. And the mountain of turmeric would simply dissolve into a small cup of water. We didn't have to do this huge, all these ornate things. So in some sense, even in the Bhagavad Gita, it says these are all ornate pujas, they are rajasic in nature and all. So it's not that we don't have resources to transform. The point is that modernity has a way of swallowing up even the rituals. So in place of a ritual that is meant to establish your faith, your faith is being absorbed by modernity, where a loudspeaker becomes more important declaration of your faith than how much faith you have. So I think in that sense, it's crazy to see robots performing puja. As a person who is into the bhakti movement, I do not know who is going to get the karma of that. The robot is going to get good karma because it did puja. So the whole idea of, we used to do Shiva Manas Puja. So the question is, on one hand, what does ritual actually mean? And yes, true, we can, for people who don't want to give it up, I think law is necessary. We have to put a ban on, we have to create kalyanis, and we have to put a law, we have to have environment. But on the other hand, we should also have people who, I think what also happens is people who are leaders are not educated in ecology. And I think when leaders say stupid things, and I think the whole population blindly follows them. I think critical thinking is already missing. And there are new rituals that are set in Vana Mahotsava. Tree planting has become such a big ritual. Whenever a famous person comes to a university or somewhere, they plant a tree. And in the recent times, every conference I've come home with a potted plant rather than like a thing. So rituals are changing. And I think the point is, because everything is so instant now, we think that change also from tomorrow, everybody should get up. Tomorrow morning, all of you will throw away all your plastic and buy glass bottles. That's not, I don't think change happens that way. It is very gradual. I think we've lost the idea to wait and gradually change. And people are shouting urgent, urgent, but it's not that urgent where you are not able to sustain what you start. I think what is needed is also a sustainable change, not only sustainability, but a sustainable change that looks into just suddenly doing something drastic will actually have impacts on so many other communities, right? Other people who are not in the privileged position. To give up your plastic is easy, but if I tell my watchman to give up this plastic, that's what is keeping his food safe from the rain that is leaking in his house. So it's important for me to realize at what level and who and what should be changed. And I think that requires a lot of thought. It's not like a go there and take all the plastics and throw it out. Yeah.
Sorry, this question is again would be addressed to you, and perhaps Dr. Shavastha might also want to respond. And you have partly answered this, so I just repeat it in case there's something. It's a long question. We find that awareness about nature is often lacking in the popular consciousness, and its acute loss has been felt more by natural heritage than when you speak of art, religion, and architecture, which are more prominent. And there's this increasing disconnect, and this will continue to grow in spite of the recognition of the effect of the pandemic and climate change, unless schools take an active interest in developing the faculties of young children. And so how do we transfer our traditions when we ourselves are so unaware of them? So, and there's also speaks of how the children who are at their most impressionable phase with creativity and are left bereft of an effective nature education, which would have resonance with what Dr. Shavastha said about Rabindranath's vision.
Yeah. Ashimji.
Yeah, I think this actually is the nub of the matter. I think the most effective and most rapid way to bring about urgent change that is required is in the realm of ecological education, and which has a pre-question, of course, which is to say who will educate the educators, right? The old one. But we still have to try, imperfect and ignorant as we might be. In fact, just this coming Thursday, I'm going to speak at a school here in Gurgaon, where I'm living right now with my parents. So I think, I'll give you one story to buttress what I'm saying here. Some years back, I met somebody who is actually a very senior corporate executive in Bombay, lives in a very plush apartment in Malabar Hill, and said that he has no air conditioners in his house. I said, how is that? And he said, because my daughters won't allow me to. And his daughters are 7 and 9, and they go to a school where their teacher basically convinced them to tell their parents to get rid of the air conditioners and to reduce the number of cars and the number of trips, etc., etc. So I think that if you work that way up the ladder of age, from the bottom, it's probably the most effective way. So we're going to be imperfect, and that's fine. But I think that's what needs to be done among the many things. And here is where I find Rabindranath to be particularly prescient in the way he saw things and did things in Shantiniketan as well as in Vishwabharati, in the way he set up the classes under the trees, in the way he did the festivals. He created festivals essentially, Halakarshan and Vriksharopan and so on, where he absorbed a lot of local customs, including Santhal customs and so on. So I think that a huge amount of work needs to go here, and a lot of positive propaganda is required to actually move things, especially when it comes to people in government and so on.
So I'd like to add that one of the other ways is through the medium of arts and creative expressions, because I find that the kind of books that are coming out and the kind of nature retellings and stories are coming out are also geared towards ecological education. And when I talk about ecological education, I think critical thinking is very important. It's not just enough to give them facts that nature is good for us, but to teach them to think for themselves. And I think when you teach children to think for themselves, they are much more open to new worlds and new imaginations. I found adult education to be a very a session in cynicism, because people have given up. But when I talk to young children, they come up with so many more alternatives to including producing energy by cycling every day, and it'll keep you fit, and then you can, they have all these crazy ideas. And so I think it's important for us to look at that. And the second thing is about indigenous people also. I think I would like to add that one of the best eco-centric thinking is an example of a song that I heard from an activist group, where the mother deer is telling her baby deer that look, they're celebrating in Rama's house and the mother is crying and the baby says, why are you crying when Rama is born and Rama's birthday is being celebrated? They said, when Rama's birthday was being celebrated, I told your father not to go out because they're going to be hunting for both the feast and your skin. And today when the drums beat, it's the skin of your father that is calling out to me. So my heart is breaking. And this song, when sung and the meaning explained, just broke my heart and broke the hearts of all the children who heard it. And from then on, they're very careful and they've stopped using leather. It's something that that was so difficult to actually convince them. And now whenever they hear that, so it's also a question of having empathy, having that spiritual empathy. It's not just a question of rationalizing ethics, but an encounter, a kind of an imagination which is emotionally supported with care. And I think if we become lopsided and become only intellectual, I think we will, if you listen to any great person who's done lots of things for the environment, I think therefore Tagore is very important. You need to capture the spiritual through the emotion and not just through thinking. I think a balance of the mind and the head is required for this environmental ethics. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I think the speaker was concerned about classroom education being at the expense of developing the creative mind. So I think we'll address that. The next question again is about how important is it to involve leaders of faith in conservation dialogues? Perhaps Professor Bilimoria or Dr. Bender would like to address this. Often the change of behavior is better achieved through faith, even when people don't understand the science of conservation.
Yeah, if I may add to that, I think maybe at some point, Professor Shavastha, you would also like to speak about how this idea of interfaith dialogue is so essential for Panikkar, and he ties it fundamentally to his notion of ecosophy. So,
yeah, well, you know, I mentioned a sustainability studies project that we have, and we call it interreligious and interdisciplinary. And I think both they have to go together. So, you know, you can't, you know, for me, it can't be just a faith conversation. I think it has to be informed by some of the data that we have to derive from and critical, Miraji mentioned critical thinking that has to be developed in this context as well, and reflective too, because sometimes, you know, people from different faiths get together and it's very platitudinal, you know, they pet each other at the back and they go away and God will be happy. But I think that's not the way to approach the whole thing. I think we have to really be very critical about each other as well. So, you know, how has Christianity responded through its history to the ecological challenge? Well, you know, they have the notion of stewardship and prelapsarian privilege over nature and so forth. Well, that has to be brought into, you know, into some perspective. And there, someone like the, you know, the Dalai Lama has been actually quite, you know, quite vocal and quite effective in this way of bringing in the Buddhist perspective, or the Jain leaders bringing in the Jain perspective in this as well. But also, I think, you know, there are not just world religions, so-called, or the major traditions, but the minor traditions as well. And Professor Srivastava talked about, mentioned, you know, the tribal people, or the, you know, the rural people who earn the living and their livelihoods are based on you know, very much on the ground, on intimate relationship with nature. Well, I have some acquaintance with the Australian Aboriginal people here in Australia, and Maori people in New Zealand as well, or the Fijian people and Pacific Island people. And, you know, there's a lot to be learned from these traditions as well. I mean, the Australian Aboriginal people have survived here, you know, 80, possibly 80,000 years. That's a long time. And you know, never destroyed nature. I mean, they had ways of controlling burning fires and so forth, but it was a way of control. What's called controlled burning in some ways, of rejuvenating again nature. There are lots of insights that come from these kinds of dialogues that have been set up among world traditions and so forth. So yeah, no, I think this is very important, and of course, Islam has to be brought in this as well, because there's a lot going on in the Islamic world, which I think we need to be concerned about as well. I mean, the production of greenhouse gases and so forth that are coming out from countries that are rapidly selling fossil fuels, which we have to be very, very, very concerned about those profit-making states. Yeah.
Thank you very much. There's a sort of follow-up comment in relation to that, which is how the Interfaith Initiative on Rainforests is one of the projects that is looking at engaging faith-based organizations, whereas in India, most environmentalists insist on secularism to a degree which excludes collaborations with faith-based organizations. And how do we bring the two groups closer to each other? So,
yeah. So, can I take that? So there is a large interfaith movement in India, which I'm a part of. We basically came together on LGBT and gender sexuality issues, and we had some interfaith movements against the Article 370. And once that started, there is strangely, it's an interfaith organization that kind of started off with the Christian organizations, and because a lot of Dalit representation was available there. And then that was spread into both the Hindu and the Islam, and we have a lot of interfaith. But the point is, at the level of the interfaith, it's become imperative for us to stress that the problem for them to dialogue with us, because Hinduism is already multiple faiths, so we started with an intra-faith dialogue. So we are starting to have dialogues intra-faith. There's so many different kinds of faith within Indian thought itself, which are not, there's Brahminical faith, there are all the Dalits and the tribal faiths, and then there's Ambedkar's strong social Buddhism. And so we have so many faiths. So what we are starting with, we said, before we start to dialogue internationally on interfaith, we should have an interfaith within India. And we have had meetings, but what happens is, the interesting thing that happens, which is also both good and bad, is the same ecological activists, the urban rights activists and the social activists who are working on all issues of water, maldevelopment, the Narmada Bachao Andolan. They are the same people who come to these interfaith meetings. So we do end up discussing the environment. But what happens is that given that there is so less encouragement for interfaith activities, there is a dismissal of religion itself as essential to human life. Like they consider that we can do away with it and replace it with something grander, like scientific inquiry. It doesn't work because our ISRO scientists still pray to Balaji before launching their rockets. So I think a recognition that religion is here to stay, the best we can do is infuse it with critical thinking is necessary. And interfaith is one of the ways, because when you talk to people of other religion, then you get a mirror. And I think that mirroring yourself is the best way to say where the spots on your nose are. Otherwise, we are so blind to what we think and do, right? And I think the more we engage with people who dissent with us, the better we'll understand ourselves and the way to move forward.
I think that will take us to the next question, which is how do festivals and...
Sorry, I think Professor Ashim was saying something.
Oh, sorry.
No, I just wanted to add a comment in order to address Kartikeya's question. Interfaith dialogue is quite central to Panikar's notion of ecosophy, and Panikar actually is among the very few of the big names in philosophy who's quite openly religious and multi-religious, and he was an ordained priest and so on. In Cultural Disarmament, he actually talks about peace as something which you receive, right? And you have to make the room to receive it. And how do you do that? Except through dialogue. So dialogue, especially where deep matters of faith are involved, is particularly necessary. And especially so when in a secular, so-called secular society, we tend to evade exactly that. And somebody asked this just now, why we fail to see the importance of the sacred when it comes to conservation. In India, unlike in Europe, the opposite of secular is not sacred, but communal. And that is a politicization or a vulgarization, I believe, of both the notion of the sacred as well as of the secular. And I think Panikar's formulation of it, which I like very much, sacred secularity, which leaves room for both the sacred and the secular to expand in a mutual conversation. So that conversation between the secular and the sacred is perhaps even more necessary because secularism itself has become a bit of a fundamentalism nowadays.
Yeah, sorry, there's also a question on the question of critical engagement. How do festivals like Holi sit among sustainable practices, and rituals like Karwa Chauth, which are gender biased, are these new practices or old ones in a new form? Would you like to say something about that? There's one question which I perhaps I don't know how much time we have. It could be our closing question. Maybe each of you would like to respond to that, though you've already addressed it, but it's a kind of sum up. If you would like to take some, how do we make these ideas accessible to people across sections and embedded in everyday consciousness and actions of people? You have all touched upon it, but if you would like to come in again from make these ideas accessible to people across sections and embedded in everyday consciousness and actions.
Yeah. So I would reject the all or none principle in rituals. So I would like to say that when we're talking about rituals, I'm talking about rituals that connect to sacred nature, right? As a gender, like today is the Kadwa Chauth of the South Indians, right? It's Varamahalakshmi, but I haven't celebrated it for years. But the question is, the problem is also a little more expansive. Now, we do ask questions about Kadwa Chauth or Holi, where we could ask the same questions about your ritual of eating pizza every day, every Sunday. You know, the ecological actions seem to be like ecological. Every action of ours is ecological. It is no action of ours is devoid of an ecological impact on society. So what happens is you're so busy fighting Kadwa Chauth that you don't fight McDonald's, which is actually breeding genetically modified chickens, right? You're not. So in that sense, I would say that we exercise our human rationality and pick our battles, because right now we are a very small group of people who are ecologically concerned. So we have to pick our battles. There are people who are fighting Kadwa Chauth. Yeah, the gender feminists, the feminists will talk about it. And a lot of women, when in my own college, when the girls were asked, there was a gender issue. So that was a problem. So you have to pick your battles. So the question is, what causes more damage to the environment? When you're talking about if you're an environmental activist, does Kadwa Chauth as a ritual cause more damage to the environment? Or does, you know, setting up of a mining company in a pristine forest cause damage to the environment? So we have to pick our battles. And when we say, again, when I say rituals, I'm not talking about an event, a festival that, see, people have played Holi for a long time, but Holi is a health concern. Holi is a way of actually, it is actually a way of sanction of orgies, sanction of breaking of human politeness, sanction of bullying within families. So there's all this, there's more complicated things about Holi than you know. It can be a kind of what you would call as a performative of some social hierarchy, right? When you touch your father's feet, there is a performance of this social. So these are some other kinds of human kinship rituals. Whereas when you're looking at the environmental impact, obviously everyone has moved from the wood to the gas, right? But there are communities that continue to use wood. So when you make a good stove that burns wood efficiently, you're actually contributing. So this needs to be not only secular sacred, but also secular sacred scientific in service of, I would say, Gandhian scientific, science in the service of human and environment. So what we do is we think of utilitarianism only as useful to us as humans, but if we start thinking of useful to us and nature, and when we add nature as our partner in that, I think human creativity is enormous. I think we can recover back what we have lost in that sense. Asimji, do you want to add something?
No, just very briefly to reiterate the importance of education, but education not just theoretical and classroom education, but actually doing things. Actually, like Meeraji was saying, I think the importance of creative expression, of art, of music, of dance, theater, especially, is very, very crucial here. And an organization like Sahapedia is exactly the kind of thing you need in order to have a sort of receptacle from where to draw ideas from where they're lacking. Actually doing things, whether it's planting saplings and then looking after them. Simple customs which have been followed across many parts of the subcontinent, such as when a child is born, you plant a sapling. And then there's a relationship between the child and the plant as it grows up and so on. I think that things are a lot simpler than we intellectuals sometimes tend to give the impression. And the one reason why I like Tagore is because he's actually so simple to follow. There's no complications of jargon or language because he was a middle school dropout. He left school at the age of 13. He was wise. So I think that one needs to develop a popular idiom and a popular vocabulary. And I want to say that in the plural, actually, popular idioms and vocabularies, depending on which part of the region or country you're coming from. And I think the registers are all there. They just have to be tapped into, like Meeraji was saying. And you have to get people to think off the straight and narrow and off the beaten track, and which is to say, simply look at your everyday experience. And there's a lot already happening there, which needs words to articulate itself, or movement, or music, or sound, or something. So I think that these languages need to be developed. We've lost languages in the sense of having forgotten them, but they're not lost as in irretrievable. And I think that with this technology, I think we can make some headway in that direction as well, although it's mediated by the screen. In this sense, I think that actual relationships with nature need to be renewed. So what the Industrial Revolution has done is it has interrupted the human engagement with the natural world in a direct way. It has mediated it with so much layering of technology and so on that we don't have access to nature, so to speak, anymore, even though it's everywhere. So one needs to create opportunities for children and young people to actually engage in those settings, and then the language will come, because children are creative, children are living beings, so they will come up with things.
I just wanted to add, it's a pity in a way that Gandhiji's experiment with education, which you call Naid Talim, or basic education, with Zakir Hussain Commission of Education as well, and there were recommendations about the relationship with nature, about the importance of ecological awareness, and actually working with the hand and picking up the soil, planting trees, and so forth. But of course, the 5-year plans and so forth, especially within the Nehruvian move towards the license Raj and industrialization, sort of eroded that. And I think and of course there was a lot of debate between Gandhi and Tagore on the basics of education and so forth. But in many ways there was a convergence as well. They were similar in quite a number of respects. So the ashram-based teaching, was for both of them. And when Gandhiji visited Tagore, he was invited to lead the convocation, which was a great symbol of the recognition of the work that Gandhiji himself was doing too. I think that some of those things can be revived in what an eco-philosopher in the US has called engaged education. Sort of, it's much more engaged rather than theoretical, sort of engaged, which I would say was also Gandhiji's project too. The kinds of education system that are now being developed among Buddhist groups in some of the Southeast Asian countries as well, where children are actually sent compulsorily for 2 months to live out in the forest hermitage, in viharas, where they would learn in comportment with nature. that's something that we actually don't do. So, you know, the children growing up in Brooklyn have no idea that milk actually comes from real animal cow, you know, rather than a picture of a cow.
I think, I'm afraid I can see that we could go on for much longer, but I think we are out of time and some of us are in a different time zone. So I think we may have to draw this evening to a close. And I want to thank all our panelists. Professor Bilimoria, it has been extraordinary. You have been connecting across the world and you have connected whole millennia of thought right from the Vedic, the shamanic traditions to the present, and your work today and its the educational programs, the macro to the micro. I wouldn't be able to sum up the ocean quickly in these 2 minutes, so I won't try. And Professor Vendur, thank you so much for your marvelous exposition about nature as a distant relative and how beautifully you communicated and reminded us that rituals are replete with multiple meanings that we might lose when we come in from outside. And I think how salutary the reminder was of our kind of facile condemnation of some things as being unequal or a kind of token environmentalism. It was a very energizing exposition, and Dr. Shavastha, it was extremely moving, your detailed sort of dwelling on Rabindranath and his work and his reinterpretation of the kind of metaphysics, the Vaishnava traditions and how he drew on them. Thank you very much also for your engagement with all the questions and to all the participants for being so closely engaged. We had not thought this was just an idea, and thank you for filling this last hour with so much meaning. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, and thank you, Niyakari, and thank you, Karthike, for organizing this, and really enjoyed very much. A lot of people have asked if this is going to be recorded and they could be available because there are people in time zones in the US who were not able to tune in. Yeah, so it was very, 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 very important, very interesting. Thank you very much, and thanks. I'd like to continue some of this conversation with Professor Srivastava on Tagore and his later discovery of his sort of painting skills, and whether or not there was actually influence of Santal's or his own emotional turmoil and upheaval and grief and so on. But I have a whole separate presentation on that at some time. We could perhaps explore on that. And Miraji and I are always in conversation. So, and this is a new conversation partners. It's a pity we can't see Sonia or some of the people in the audience, but I hope that we're connected in some ways.
Yes, and I'm sorry that
maybe Niharika, you could share our email addresses because some people want to contact us.
Yeah, I think there is some people, some questions that have come in. We will send it and share your email addresses. And it's possible that I think you had not connected at the time. Our executive director, Dr. Sudha Gopalakrishnan, was welcoming all of you, and she was actually wanting to wait. And I'm sorry that you couldn't be there at the beginning. Sorry for the technology problem. Yeah. And so thank you very much indeed. And we hope we might sort of perhaps request you sometime later for continuing this conversation with us as well. Thank you.
Choose a day when I don't have to be in connection with Moscow. Right now we're doing a project round on connected with philosophy and so on. Yeah, so there's another 2 hours work for me. It's 11:30 p.m. But that's a dedication. Thank you very much, and pranam. Namaste.
Thank you.
I take leave.